Of all the atheists I've talked to, objectivists seem to be the most peculiar of the bunch. And the reason for this is that, unlike most atheists, they seem to know for certain that there is no God. They are not content with just saying, there likely isn't a God, or we don't see evidence for God, so therefore there probably is no God. No, they know with 100% certainty that there is no God out there, and that there are no possible scenarios in which a God could exist. But how could they possibly know this? I mean, this seems to be a very impossible thing to claim. To claim this, you'd have to essentially prove a universal negative, and, well, to do that, you'd have to disprove every possible way in which God could exist. And for what I've seen, they certainly haven't done this. I mean, there's, lots of arguments out there. It doesn't even have to be a classical religious deity. It could be a form of deism or pantheism or something like that, or, how many possible religions are out there? It could be a God from any one of those. There's no way you could possibly debunk them all. So what do? They basically claim that the very concept of God is itself self-contradictory. And they attempt to do this from a pair of premises. The first is that existence is identity, and the second is that consciousness is identification. Okay, fine. I don't see anything particularly wrong with either of these two premises, but I don't see why that would necessitate God not existing either. I can very well conceive of a scenario in which both of those statements are true, and yet God exists anyway. So let's suppose that existence is comprised of a number of existents, okay? Let's say that all of reality is comprised of a galaxy, a tree, a rock, and a Cartesian ego, which I've represented here as a microtubule with an OR state in it. Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with this setup, right? I mean, everything here is natural. There's no supernatural elements, no angels or demons or God or heaven or hell or anything like that. It's just straight up the scientific realm that we see. Now, we could certainly imagine objective reality existing without one of these things. Let's say we take the galaxy away. Well, we just then have a tree and a rock and a Cartesian ego left. There's nothing intrinsically impossible about this either. And of course, we can then continue on like this and take the tree away and then take the rock away and then keep taking things away until the only thing that we have left is the Cartesian ego. All of existence is comprised of only a single Cartesian ego. Well, now this ego, which is a mind, would be, it would know everything that exists, because everything that exists are just thoughts within it, right? So it would be omniscient then, and then it would also be able to control everything in existence because, well, a mind can control all of its thoughts, right? So this mind would, in essence, be God. You'd have an omnipotent, omniscient mind. Well, that sounds like God. Well, and all we've done here is take away existence to get to this point. There's God, but there's nothing particularly supernatural about this God. This is a completely plausible scenario. But for some reason, objectivists won't have this, and this really boggles my mind. There's nothing in the laws of logic that would prevent this scenario from being true, so why couldn't it be true, right? If you're going to be strong atheists, the only real way to claim that there is no God is that it entails a contradiction necessarily, and, well, this doesn't entail a contradiction. It's completely plausible. Furthermore, this wouldn't violate either of the objectivist axioms. Existence is identity. Okay, all that exists is an I. You're a self-identity. And consciousness is identification. Well, the I would be a identity that identifies itself, right? It's what the whole concept of self-identification or self-awareness is in the first place. So this doesn't conflict with objectivist epistemology at all. And now, the funny thing is they say that this necessitates some kind of dichotomy between the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness. But that simply doesn't follow from the premises they give. And the reason for this is that you could simply have existence being consciousness. But they don't say that's possible. And after a little digging, I figured out why. To understand this, you got to look at a quote from Ayn Rand. Here she says, "If nothing exists, there can be no consciousness. A consciousness with nothing to be conscious of is a contradiction in terms. A consciousness conscious of nothing but itself is a contradiction in terms. Before it could identify itself as consciousness, it had to be conscious of something. If that which you claim to perceive does not exist, that which you possess is not consciousness." Well, it's a little hard to follow through the logic of that. It doesn't seem, she's not actually saying it as an argument, but let's see if we can parse this up here a little bit and see what she's getting at. Okay, here's the middle of the quote. "A consciousness conscious of nothing but itself is a contradiction in terms." And then she goes on to explain the reason for this. She goes on to say, before it could identify itself as consciousness, it had to be conscious of something. Well, I don't see a particular contradiction there. Okay, so it had to be conscious of something to be conscious. Well, the very first thing that a mind is conscious of is itself. That's the whole point of the Descartes' I think, therefore I am. He shuts off all knowledge from the outside world and, just for hypothetical reasons, pretends it's all an illusion, and then deduces the only thing that he can know for certain. And he just starts from himself and says, I know that I exist because if I doubted I existed, then there would be a doubter doubting that I existed, which means that there would actually be someone who's doubting, which is myself. So Rand's explanation here doesn't really explain anything at all. She's supposed to be trying to argue that consciousness needs, consciousness that is conscious of nothing but itself is a contradiction, and the reason for this is it needs something to be conscious of. Well, the whole point was that, you could have a something which is consciousness that is conscious of itself. That's what we're arguing, that's what we're debating in the first place here. And the only way to make any sense of this is if she's saying that the I isn't actually a something, right? Otherwise, it would be quite self-evident that you could have a consciousness that was conscious of nothing but itself. Furthermore, this position is self-contradicting. In order to be conscious of something, there has to be a conscious observer that is observing it. That's the it she's referring to here. So she says, it had to be conscious of something. Well, what is it? There's no such thing as a non-conscious observer, or an observer who's not self-aware of himself. So all she's really doing is begging the question here. She's using her own conclusion, albeit implicitly, as her premise. It would be equivalent to saying, a consciousness conscious of nothing but itself is a contradiction in terms because it isn't conscious of anything. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, she goes on to actually make that same, a larger begging the question argument again. And we can see that when we parse up the beginning and end of her comment. Of course, this is all very implicit, which makes it very difficult to realize that she is begging the question, because it's sort of implicitly written into the definitions she's using, such that the question never comes up. So let's look at the beginning and end of her comment here. If nothing exists, there can be no consciousness. A consciousness which, with nothing to be conscious of, is a contradiction in terms. And if that which you claim to perceive does not exist, what you possess is not consciousness. Here she's starting with her own conclusion again, that a consciousness that is conscious of nothing but itself does not classify as an anything, and therefore is a nothing. And then we have the last part of the statement here, and here she says, if that which you claim to perceive does not exist, and that was her assumption from the beginning here, and then she's saying, what you possess is not consciousness. Well, whoever said that a self-conscious I that didn't know anything else didn't exist in the first place? Well, for that we have to go back to the beginning here, where she says that, to be conscious has to be conscious of something. And so, well, the I isn't a something, and so therefore it doesn't exist by itself. But once again, that's her premise. She's basically arguing around in circles here, and then hiding the circularity of her argument up in the terminology she uses so that people have a hard time calling her on it. This is simply presuppositionalist crap. Okay, I mean, this isn't philosophy. This is, if I wrote a philosophy paper like this in college, I get an F on the paper immediately. This isn't an argument. It's a giant exercise in circular question begging. And what's motivating this? Well, if you look at objectivist epistemology, you see that they completely throw out any a priori category entirely. They rely exclusively on the a posteriori, meaning that they think that all that exists are all that they can see. Right? This is the same problem that positivism runs into. It detonates itself for the same reason. So when we strip away all the obfuscating language, basically what comes out of this is that they are defining all space-time, energy, and matter as all that exists, and therefore, because God isn't made of space-time and energy and matter that we can observe, therefore God doesn't exist. Well, sorry, but that's been completely thrown out the window, okay? Now, you point to modern physics for that, but we don't even need to go there. We can demonstrate things from metaphysics and philosophy of mind to point out that that's not necessarily the case. But of course, they can never actually be made to realize that because they reject any a priori philosophy claims in the first place, such as those. And the reason they reject there are any a priori, they have an a priori rejection of any a priori claims. Well, the reason for that is, I don't know, that boggles my mind. They must be programmed to believe that because they simply assert it. So now, not only is objectivism's claim to strong atheism a giant exercise in question begging, it's actually self-refuting. Its subtle positivism is self-refuting in that you can't claim a priori that there are no a priori truths. And secondly, it's self-refuting in that it's saying that you have to have, You have to have something out there to be conscious of before you can be conscious. Well, the whole point here is that, you have to have an I or a self that is conscious of something out there in the first place. So this entire claim that there is a dichotomy between the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness, and therefore God must necessarily not exist because of that, implodes in on itself. It's not a valid argument. And since it's not a valid argument, objectivists have no claim to being strong atheists. Of course, I'm probably going to get a whole lot of vociferous rebuttals from various objectivists who are not too happy that I've pointed out Ayn Rand's fallacies, but, well, sorry, that's just the way it is.